Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is CF Claire. I'm a paranormal and fantasy romance author. I have a passion project that is a fantasy romance trilogy story, and I love watching other people's outlining videos, and I thought it could be kind of fun to show what I am doing. And so this is the first in a short video series on the template I came up with to help organize my plot points and help my outlining process for the passion project that I am working on in my off time. I have a contemporary shifter romance that is my main work in progress right now. But the idea for this is that I have one of each of these color-coded for each of the books in the trilogy. And then I wanted to have something that I could print out and just like hang on the wall. So I had all three books, like the major plot points of all three books, just that I could see at a glance to help me come up with, what happens in between and how I want it to play out. And so this is for the first book. And you can see at the top there are overarching trilogy plot points. That's something that I'll talk about more in the second video in this series. Right now I'm going to talk more about the story structure beats, what I mean when I say each of those, because a couple of them are my own kind of thing. With the italicized stuff. Not all of the italicized stuff, but some of it is just my own conceptualization. And there's some things I want to say about that. But then here's the second book in the series. And you can see those overarching trilogy plot points. There's different ones. And then the last book in the series. So I have these printed out, hanging on my wall, so I can just look at it and work on it when I have the time. So I'm super not into prescriptive writing philosophy, so I'm really just sharing what has been working well for me, and if it doesn't work for you, then that is totally fine. Don't worry about it. I'm sure there's another different, better method out there that will fit you better. I'm also a methodological plotter, and so I really like the outlining process, and I get a lot of inspiration out of having lots of beat points, and I don't find it limiting. I find it freeing, I find it exciting. I love outlining my character arcs and theme first before really thinking about plot events or even antagonists, because then when I do it that way, my end product is a lot truer to the internal vision I have for it. So I find that if I start outlining using plot events and world building and a villain first, then that's when I write myself into corners and I get frustrated and I just hit a lot of roadblocks and end up wanting to abandon my projects. And when I start with character arc and theme, then I stay motivated and I'm passionate and I'm excited to see how those things play out. So that is just the context of how I'm going through this and my process. So I really am talking about beat points in these videos, and I'm really not talking about plot itself. And this first video is going to be going over the beats of the template because I have a bit of a different style than I've really seen any other people use. And I like to think of my quarters in two phases. I like to organize plot events by focusing on a certain question I'm trying to answer each quarter and things like that. So I'm going to go through the template using a story concept that my 4-year-old came up with to use as an example. And then in the next video in the series, I'll talk about how I use this template to focus in on the main trilogy beat points. And then in the third video in the series, I'll talk about how I'm using this template to plot my specific trilogy, talking about that trilogy, also using romance beats that I've adapted from Gwen Hayes' book, Romancing the Beat, and where I'm going to put those within my trilogy, and also where I'm going to put archetypal character arc beats as conceptualized by K.M. Weiland in her book, Writing Archetypal Character Arcs, because my two main characters in the trilogy are going to be going on, respectively, the hero arc, queen arc, and king arc for the protagonist, and for my secondary main character, the king arc, the crone arc, and the mage arc. And so I'm going to talk about how I am using those character arc points in the outlining phase, and I'm using those to come up with the plot of the story. So that is in the third video. So if that's up your alley, then stay tuned, but for now we're going to just talk about the beats on here so that you have a better understanding of how I'm going to be using them when I go over how they work within the actual trilogy points. So a note on the timing of the beats. Classical story structure has a beat every 12.5% through the book to keep pacing moving along. I like to start off a story concept assuming it will be 80,000 words long, which is about 320 pages, because when you break that number down, every 12.5% of the book is 10,000 words. So that is just so nice and simple, and it's fine if the story is longer or shorter, right? But when planning the first draft, it's a nice, easy place to start from. So every 10,000 words, there's another major story beat that plays out, and for me, that's really helpful because I can break that down even further and then think of chapter length. Like 3,000 words is a pretty standard size for a chapter, so that helps me narrow down what's happening between every beat because I know that I'm looking for about 3 or 4 chapters before the next beat plays out. And then you just adjust that as you need to as you're going through the outlining phase. And you don't have to keep it at 80,000 words. That could be too long, too short, too whatever, but it's a nice, easy place to start. So a lot of people get really turned off by story structure. I was one of them. I thought it sounded boring and formulaic and not interesting at all. I literally only got into story structure like 2 years ago, and I've been writing my entire life, and seriously writing for the last 10 years. And by the way, despite everything that I'm saying in this, I haven't published any books to date as of September 2024. So take everything with a grain of salt and just kind of use your own judgment. This is just what is making sense for me and what is getting me excited. So I do think that kind of aversion to story structure comes back to kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of what structure does. I think there's a big misconception that, it demands you to make certain choices for your protagonist, and so then it feels very limiting and confining and generic. And that's really unfortunate because the more that I study it, the more I'm coming to realize that it's really a tool to help you with pacing and to help keep your story moving along, and that if you do have a full understanding of what each beat is meant to achieve, the actual function of it, then you can use it in a really interesting way. You can twist it, you can subvert it, you can do a lot of things with it. I'm sure everyone watching this has some degree of familiarity with story structure, so I'm just going to give my own take on it, and I'm going to link some videos where I got a lot out of the way that other people described them, and I thought they did an awesome job, and it really clarified a lot of things for me. And then what I'm saying here is me spitting out my own version of that stuff after internalizing it for, a few months, a couple of years. So the first 20,000 words of the book, the first quarter, we're focusing on answering the question of implied, who is the protagonist, and what did they want, and why. So this quarter is setting up the stakes for why the protagonist is going to get involved in the main storyline. So there are 2 phases, the way that I think of it, for the first quarter. The first phase is the status quo, and the second phase is the debate. So in the status quo, we're meeting the protagonist, we're seeing the setup for the world, and this is the normal life for the protagonist. It's one of the most immediate things within the status quo is the hook, where you're going to be setting up an interesting situation and a character that makes readers want to learn more. As an example, my son's concept, here we go. The concept is a children's fantasy book premise. So in the status quo, we would learn that the protagonist is a young child, that they live with their younger brother in a small house on the edge of the woods, and that he wants to find his mom. That she disappeared a few years ago. She's not the only one. There's some evil curse or witch or something going on, and he wants to be the one to end it and save his mom. So that's the premise of the example we're going to use as we go through these beats. So 12.5% through the book is the disruption. It's also called the inciting event or the call to adventure. I just like the disruption more, so that's what I use. So the disruption plays out by the 12.5% mark of the book, and it's something the protagonist can't ignore, otherwise they will, right? So I like to think of it as a door being opened, and there's no way to ignore that the door is opened. And on the other side of the door is the upside-down world of the second quarter. The protagonist does not want to go through that door because it means leaving behind everything they know, the normal world and the status quo. Even if the status quo isn't a good one necessarily, it's better than whatever's on the other side of that door. So in our example, our protagonist has been training himself on how to be a hero so he can go and find his mom, but he knows he can't leave his little brother to do it. Then the disruption plays out. His dad goes missing. He can't ignore that. That's impossible. No one who's gone missing has ever returned. So if he wants to see his dad again, which he does, then he needs to do something about it. The door of no return has been opened. There's a choice he needs to make about what to do about it. This leads to the second phase of the first quarter, which is the debate. So now there's a debate about what to do. The stage of hesitating outside of that door of no return, trying everything they can not to go through it. And so there's usually an initial refusal of the call here, to use classical story beats, but I prefer using the broader title of debate because it's easier for me to conceptualize. So our protagonist's father has now disappeared. He wants to go and investigate and commit to this quest now of not just finding his mom, but his dad too. Yikes, like everything's going nuts, right? But he still has a problem because he's got this younger brother that he's responsible for. And he knows that it's really not responsible to bring him on this quest. So what's he going to do? He has to do something. That's what we're exploring in this phase. So maybe he tries to go to the local magical detectives on the case, thinking that maybe they can be in charge of finding his dad and he'll stay with his little brother. But a lot of people have been going missing and they don't seem to be making progress, and when he goes to tell them about it, they have a very uninspiring response. So then maybe he tries to find someone he trusts who can watch his little brother so he can go on the quest without worrying about the brother, but that doesn't pan out, and you get the idea. Like, they're trying everything they can not to go through the door of no return. But they can't stay in that phase forever. They can't stay in any of these phases forever. So the debate phase ends when they realize that they have to go through the door of no return and commit to a goal, which will force them to leave behind the status quo forever. In our story, my 4-year-old says that our protagonist's little brother now goes missing. So he's got mom missing for years, dad went missing maybe a week ago or something, and now his little brother is missing. The stakes are higher than ever, and so he's just willing to do whatever it takes to save these people that he loves. So the authorities who are supposed to be in charge of this kind of stuff haven't been making any progress. It's been years, right? So it's up to him to go and find all of them and save them. And so his decision is made. He has to go through that door of no return. He cannot stay in his normal world because the stakes are too high. So now we're in the second quarter, and the second and third quarter are going to deliver on the promise of the premise that we just set up. So if we set up that there's these magical disappearances, then the second and third quarter have to deal with finding out about those disappearances. Otherwise, why do we set it up in the first quarter? Right, so we're starting to think about how we're going to deliver on the promise of our premise. In this quarter in particular, I use the question of how do they try to get what they want? Because that helps me narrow down on their immediate actions and what they need to learn. And they're in this upside down world trying to be themselves when there is now a new paradigm and there's this phase of introducing new settings, new characters, new information, but all the while the protagonist hasn't had any actual character arc change at all yet. They're very much still in a reactive phase until they reach that midpoint pivot. So our protagonist is beginning to search for clues. They're thinking, where do I start? Maybe they're talking to other people whose loved ones have gone missing, trying to find any similarities in the situation, that kind of thing. But we can't stay in this phase forever either. Our protagonist, but also our readers, need a reminder of what's at stake if the protagonist fails, so things have to keep happening. So this beat is also called the first pinch point. I just like the reminder of the stakes better because it announces exactly what it's supposed to do. And there are a lot of ways you could do it, and a lot of variables you can use to make this plot point as effective as possible, and a lot of them are going to depend on the style of writer you are, as well as the genre you're writing in, but at its core, it has to serve the function of reminding the readers and protagonist of what's at stake if they don't achieve their goal. Often it does this by showcasing a weakness that the protagonist has, and or showing the strength of the bad guys, and or presenting a philosophical challenge to whatever misbelief your protagonist holds. Probably other factors as well that you could use, but this is an example of my 4-year-old's concept, so I'm just going to stop there. For this, we could say something like, our protagonist has been gathering clues of what's been going on, and maybe here is where he learns that he's not the only one who's been motivated to go and find their loved ones before. that other people have, and one of them discovered that the further you go into the forest, the more cats there are. So this new character thinks that there's a witch somewhere in the woods turning people into cats for some reason. Up till now, no one's been talking about witches, really. There's just been people disappearing. So our protagonist is a child. Well, they have no magic. They're a kid. They're in no way equipped to defeat a witch, and if this information is correct, then their little brother and mother and father may have been turned into cats. He doesn't know how to turn them back. He's hoping that this information is false and there's a more palatable truth out there, but no one has ever come back once they've vanished. And the more he thinks about it, the more he realizes, you know what? There are kind of a lot of cats in the village. And he doesn't remember there always being this many cats when he was younger. So this accomplishes a reminder of the stakes for the reader, as well as learning new information that will send our protagonist into the woods in search of confirmation of this idea. And for our protagonist, this is my son's concept, so I'm being as true to his story as I can. This isn't necessarily an upping of the stakes. It may even be lessening to some degree. And the stakes now, we go from vague missing and presumed possibly dead to maybe they're being turned into cats. But it's a more concrete possibility, and someone else has gone and investigated, and this is, a real possibility, and not just something vague and unclarified. It's specific, and it does remind everyone of how ill-equipped our protagonist is as a child to do anything about the situation, whether this information is correct or if the truth is darker. And they're able to go into the second phase of the quarter, which is where they just are learning more. Now, I made this template in like a day a couple weeks ago. So when I'm actually sitting down and looking at how I want to use it for my own trilogy in particular, which I haven't been able to spend a lot of time doing yet, I may just change the name of this phase. I don't know if I want to keep it learning more. It's not great, but it is like functionally that is what's happening. They're learning more in this phase. So they're in this phase of learning more because if they're not learning more about their plot goal, then what the hell is going on in the book, right? So this isn't a beat point, though. It's not a singular scene. It is a phase. They'll learn a lot of things, a couple of things. They may learn false things. They're going places. They're doing things. Things are happening. So in our story, our protagonist is now going to go into the woods. He's going to try to see for himself if there's any truth to this idea that there might be a witch in the woods and possibly people are being turned into cats. He's going to go find out for himself. In the woods, as he goes, he's learning more. We could say he does find cats and that they do act kind of oddly, and everything is looking like, yeah, these might be people who have been magically turned into cats. So halfway through the book, we need to have a midpoint pivot, or we're going to just remain a little bit stuck. And that's a term I heard from K.M. Weiland, who has written many writing craft novels. I'm always talking about her. She has a YouTube channel as well, a podcast, all kinds of great things. I'll leave some links in the description. When I just hear midpoint, that doesn't help my brain at all. When I hear midpoint pivot, I can see my character literally turning and walking toward the right direction that will enable them to ultimately enter into the climax of the book and determine whether they will achieve or fail to achieve their story goal. So adding that word pivot actually completely frees my mind to conceptualize what I could not before. So in the first 3/4 of the book, you may be familiar with people saying that the protagonist is really in a reactive phase, and I really like that. I actually have a different beat sheet that I look at different stages of the outlining process because I am so visual. But it looks like this. It's the same information, but laid out in a different format. And they start the book in the middle, and the quarters are laid out kind of nuts on purpose because they start off not being able to work towards the story's climax. They're not even going in the right direction. They're actually headed to the left, going towards the midpoint, and that's the way I prefer to conceptualize this reactive phase, because they're just reacting to things. They have not received the information that they need in order to pivot and start going towards the climax of the story. So I am going to just borrow K.M. Weiland's phrasing for this from her book, Structuring Your Novel, where she says that the characters are making less informed decisions prior to the midpoint pivot. And after the midpoint, they should be able to pivot and start choosing actions that are more effective. So knowing that, we know that however you want to do it, the function of the midpoint will be to get your protagonist to pivot towards what they need to know in order to make those more informed choices that will lead them to the climax. So it's not the key piece they need in order to be successful, because that won't happen until the middle of the fourth quarter at the realization, but it's whatever they need to learn in order to at least send them in the right direction, because prior to this, they will have been going the wrong way. So if it's a piece of information they need to learn, they learn it here. If it's a talisman they need to find, they find it here. There's so many ways you could do this from a plot perspective. I'm really not going to get into it, but the midpoint is so huge, so vital, and can accomplish so many cool things. The one other thing I will mention about it is that usually there is some outer story goal, progress or realization or achievement or loss or whatever it is. This is also where the protagonist is confronted with a new philosophical paradigm. So their misbelief is challenged by this plot point, and they're confronted now with their first real introduction to the thematic statement of your story. And this is really important because in the third and fourth quarters, that's where all of the character arc really starts to kick in and we see how they change. And if you don't have a philosophical pivot here at the midpoint, then the character arc really falls a little bit flat. So yeah, there's a lot we could talk about with the midpoint, but we're going to stop there and take a look at our example story. So our protagonist has been journeying through the woods and he's finding all of these cats, and it seems like, yes, they're actually people being turned into cats, but he has no proof. He's literally wandering in the woods. He's not able to make a plan for what he's going to do about it. If it is true, he doesn't have enough information. So what he needs in order to be able to pivot toward the climax is to get that information. So he's going to find a hut in the woods. He'll see the witch. There's no doubt about it anymore. She's definitely turning people into cats. This is what was missing. So now he can start to make a plan on what he's going to do about it. So we also see a philosophical shift in his thinking. This particular example is a little bit funny because I do want to be true to my son's concept, and so this protagonist has a flat arc and not the more typical positive change arc. So he starts off with this very adorable childlike belief that I'm capable, I can find my mom, my dad, my brother, I can be a hero, I can save everyone. And that's his attitude as he's going through the story. It's the innocence of youth. It's very endearing. But here at the midpoint, he's confronted with this opposing thematic proposition, which is that he is not capable. He may not be able to find his mom and dad and little brother if they're cats now. And how could he possibly be a hero? He can't save anyone. He's just a little kid and he's not equipped to defeat a witch. I'm not going to spend a lot of time thinking about the way that he encounters this hut in the woods. I'm never actually going to rate this story, but however it happens, it needs to accomplish both of the functions of giving him the information he needs to be able to start planning for the climax, even as it is making him confront his opposing philosophical belief that directly challenges his previous one. So now we're entering the third quarter of the book. Things are becoming more clear. They have at least a better idea of the odds they're up against, but the stakes are rising and the tension is building. Clock might start ticking. They had this thematic or philosophical belief introduced in the midpoint, but they haven't yet let go of their initial misbelief yet. They now have the information they need to start planning a more effective method of achieving their goal. Pressure is mounting, though, and things are starting to get kind of worse. So in the first phase of the third quarter, this focuses in on how they can incorporate what they just learned into a plan to achieve their goal. So in our example story, our protagonist is trying to figure out what to do with this new information. So what does he do now? He's also just had this sort of splash of cold water that, oh yeah, he's just a kid. Maybe he can't do anything about it, but he can't give up because the stakes are too high. So maybe what he does is he goes back to town and tells this magical detective agency about what he's found, since he's just a kid. But maybe they don't believe him. After all, how could a little kid find out something so important when they've been looking for a long time and they found nothing? So it's a dead end. And so he's thinking, okay, so what now? Like, he tried everything he could. We need to have our second reminder of the stakes, or the second pinch point. So it's not just a reminder either, but the stakes usually go up even higher. I like to think of it like this is the place where they find a bomb and it's lit, and there's no way to unlight it. So we're going to say that at this point, he goes back into the woods and he's going to spy on the witch. He tried to get help. It didn't work, but he's going to see what he can do. And when he gets back into the woods, he tries to hide and stake her out. But he's a kid and she's a witch and she finds him. So now we're in the second phase of the third quarter, and things are seeming worse and harder than ever, and yet also more important and impossible to walk away from than ever. And they're thrust into the second half of the quarter, which, honestly, again, when I plot my trilogy, I may change the name for this phase as well, but I'm calling it the False Victory Phase for now. And that's because my own interpretation of the last beats of the novel, which are just about to come up, I use specific terms which are not commonly used across the board. I've seen some people use them. I don't think I came up with any of them, but in classical story structure, at the end of the third quarter, that beat is often called either the calamity or the false victory, quickly followed by all is lost. But for me, what makes sense is that this whole second phase is setting up a false victory for the protagonist that will then be toppled at the end of the quarter by a reversal when the inevitable scene does take place. So I'm calling the whole phase the false victory phase. So for our protagonist, maybe this is where he tries to explain away his presence by her hut, and maybe she seems to be buying it, and she invites him into her hut to feed him, and he can't say no, but she doesn't seem that bad, and maybe this is good because maybe he's going to find out what he needs while he's in this hut to actually be able to stop her. So yeah, he goes into the hut. But obviously, it cannot be that simple. They haven't gone through any character arc change yet. So at the beginning of the story, we set up this premise that people have been disappearing. We learn that they're being turned into cats. So what's the inevitable scene that we would expect to happen to our protagonist? Yes. He becomes one of those missing people. The witch has to turn him into a cat. If you brainstorm, you could probably come up with an alternative scene that also feels inevitable, but I'm not going to do that. I like this. It's very simple. It feels inevitable. He's a kid trying to go up against a witch. He can't win right away. He gets turned into a cat. So now we're starting the fourth quarter, and this is the quarter that really solidifies the character arc that they've been on. So I like to think of this quarter in the context of answering the question, what is it that they need to learn in order to achieve their goal? Then I can really hone in on what an appropriate plot event would be to facilitate that major realization they need to have at the halfway mark of this quarter, which I call conveniently the realization. And this is literally just a thematic statement, which can be implied, it can be stated, it can be, you do it in whatever way makes sense for you, but the point is that the protagonist needs to internalize it. So I know that in this story, it's a flat arc, so he's going to just remember his belief in himself at the realization, and he will once again return to believing that he is capable. He can save his mom, his dad, his little brother. He can be a hero. So I know he needs to realize that, and I know this realization will somehow empower and enable him to defeat the witch at the climactic moment. So they're in the first phase of the fourth quarter, and we're hovering right on the brink of major character change. But first, there's this mourning period we need to go through, because in that inevitable scene, the bomb went off. Metaphorically speaking, your protagonist suffered a death of some sort, and now they're in this phase of all is lost. The long dark night of the soul, the black moment, there are a lot of names for it. In our story, the protagonist went from feeling like maybe they were just about to figure out some way to actually defeat the witch, and instead, they got turned into a cat. So their plan completely failed. They can't save anyone. They can't even save themselves. All is lost. Something needs to happen to push them up out of this dark night of the soul and remind them of who they are. They have to have the realization. In a lot of stories, this might come from a pep talk, but honestly, there are so many ways you can accomplish this. The important thing is just making sure you set up the realization so it doesn't just come out of nowhere. But we're not talking about that in this video. So anyways, they have the realization. So whatever the thematic statement of your book is, this is where they have it, where they internalize it. If it is a flat arc, like ours is, they remember their initial belief. And if it is the more common positive change arc, they let go of forever the lie that they believe, the misbelief, and embrace the truth or the theme, the thematic statement, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same. It's essentially a resurrection. I'm not going to spend a lot of time thinking about the plot event for our example story, but something happens to make him remember that he can save the day even though he is a kid. And maybe not only that, but maybe that the only way to save the day is because he's a kid. So somehow that plays out. He has this realization, and that enables him to move to the second phase of the quarter, the climax. So this phase is the setup and playing out of the climactic sequence. And in our story, this is where the protagonist confronts the witch, now empowered by the realization that he just had. So the climax is more of a climactic sequence that will culminate in the climactic moment, where the protagonist's goal is definitively either achieved or lost, and the story is over. So in our story, the protagonist defeats the witch, somehow, because they've been able to internalize the thematic statement that they had in the realization that they are capable, they are a hero, they can save the day, even though they are a kid, or because they are a kid. And we have the resolution right at the end. So after they've achieved or lost their goal, how does that affect their world? So in our story, we're going to say that somehow Through the process of defeating the witch, the magic spell ends. Everyone who was a cat turns back into themselves. It's a complete happy ending. Our protagonist has accomplished their goal. They've saved the day. They've proved not just to themselves, but to everyone that they were right, they're capable, they are a hero. And you'll notice in my example story, I literally never set up a reason for why the witch is doing this. I don't know her motivation. It's not important for the beats. You're using the beats to make sure that your character is going on the right arc that you want them to go on. And then when you're thinking of how those beats are playing out, that's when you would think of who is this antagonist witch? What does she want? Why is she turning people into cats? And that's how you get a lot of the stuff that's in between the beats. But it really, I don't know, I don't think it really has any relevance on the actual beats themselves. So anyways, that's a walkthrough of the template beats, the way that I use them. And in the next video, I'll talk about how I'm using this template in the context of the trilogy I'm plotting. So each book will use these beats, but more than that, some of the beats in each book will perform sort of double duty as not only a beat in the singular book, but also a larger trilogy beat. So that's the main focus of that next video, and if that's something you're interested in, then check that out. And if any of this helped you, please let me know. I would love to hear it, and if it didn't help but something else did, then let me know that as well, and I'd love to check it out. I just love story structure. I love hearing other people's ideas. This is what I've been working on, and I thought, maybe someone else would like it too. So if you're interested in it, there is a download in the description. You can print it out and see what's up if it helps you at all.